Hi, everyone. We're here. Thanks for joining us on The Same Drugs. We're live today with my friend Isabella Malbin, who I only met in real life recently, which was very nice. But I'm going to let her intro herself. Tell us a bit about yourself, Isabella.
So I am Isabella. I am a home birth attendant and consultant. I was peaked in 2020, I think it was, after getting kicked out of a fertility
it looks
awareness.
like we're freezing a little bit.
Oh,
there,
can you hear and see me now?
Yeah, sorry, we got a bit jerky there, but I think we're good now.
What was the last thing you heard?
Your name.
Okay, so
so we've got that covered.
Great. And it's conveniently listed under my picture, so that's great. So I am an adult human female. I think hopefully that's obvious. I am a home birth attendant and consultant, and I was peaked in 2020 after getting kicked out of a fertility awareness teacher training program for refusing to go along with all the gender nonsense. And that's actually relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, because I was on a path to educate women on the power of learning their biosigns as a means of reproductive sovereignty. And so now I'm doing the YouTube channel. I'm a women's life coach. I do a lot of virtual coaching now. I still attend births. But yeah, the fertility awareness stuff that I was so passionate about teaching, I actually stopped doing because the trans stuff was just, I couldn't ignore it anymore, and kind of set me on a kind of tangential path. But I am still really passionate about fertility awareness and what it means for reproductive sovereignty and bodily autonomy. So I'm excited to get into that, and then obviously the abortion stuff.
How is everybody doing on the other end? Is the sound okay, and is the picture okay, and is the Wi-Fi okay? It looks like you might be having a little bit of connectivity issues on your end, but I'm not sure. What's your connection like over there? Is it usually okay? Is it pretty solid?
It's usually great. I only run into issues when I have my VPN on and it's off.
Okay.
I'm double checking now.
Yeah, okay, well, everyone is saying it's good on their end, so maybe that's just me and my
I'm not freezing. I'm not freezing up for that.
Okay, then let's not worry about it. Sorry to interrupt. So, I mean, I wanted to talk to you specifically in light of this new legislation in Texas, which, as I understand it, allows people to sue doctors who help women get abortions after 6 weeks. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And I think it extends to any practitioner, really. It's unclear to me whether the person could also be targeted if they're like a lay person, or if it needs to be some kind of licensed professional. But it was quite ominous in its announcement, so much so that it's, I think, maybe even intentionally kind of unclear. But yeah.
Yeah, because when I was reading about it, it was saying that, or, when I was reading about it in the media, reporting was saying that it was that any individual could sue any person who helps a woman get an abortion after 6 weeks. And then elsewhere I was reading about it and they said specifically doctors. So I wasn't entirely clear on that either. But I mean, regardless, I think I feel really frustrated, especially after having talked to people like Mary Lou Singleton and Carol Downer, who you of course are very familiar with. And that we are only allowed to talk about abortion and the debate around abortion in terms of whether it's legal or illegal. And it's it's not a very feminist approach, even despite the fact that, you know, the majority of feminists limit the conversation to that as well. And then when you try to explain to people or suggest, you know, like, I don't really, I mean, of course I want abortion to be legal, but I'm not actually really that invested in that fight, because I don't believe that we should have to rely on these kinds of parameters. And it's not even that I don't believe it, it's that we don't have to. And this wasn't always the way, you know, abortion didn't only come into existence in like the second wave feminist movement within this fight for legal abortion. I mean, women have been, you know, I don't even know. Do you even use the term abortion? Is there like a term that you prefer to use when you're talking about these things?
I use the term abortion, termination, ending a pregnancy, releasing a pregnancy. Releasing a pregnancy could also refer to miscarriage. So I think the word abortion, I think the word termination is useful in that it's explicit and it's not like euphemistic either.
Okay. And I want to actually mention before we go forward that if anybody has questions or comments, obviously post them in the live chat. Don't post them in the comments below because I won't see them. I'm only monitoring the live chat right now. And the best way to actually get me to notice your question is by using the super chat, because sometimes the live chat is just moving too quickly and I miss a lot of stuff in the conversation. But let's talk about, I think I first heard the term reproductive sovereignty from Mary Lou Singleton, and you use that term also. What does that mean?
So when I think of sovereignty, reproductive sovereignty, I think of women who are releasing dependence on the state. So women who are cultivating resilience, who are cultivating the resources, the networks, the community to be able to source their reproductive needs from one another. So this used to be passed down by mothers, grandmothers, sisters, cousins. Now it's a bit more difficult. Like we've been severed from that matrilineal kind of wisdom. When I think sovereignty, I think of confidence in young women. I think of, really resourcefulness. But again, formally now, to get that education, like to be sovereign in a reproductive sense, requires accessibility to education because it's been so systematically removed. So the information is not complex. Like, for example, learning how to do at-home abortion or learning how to practice fertility awareness-based method for preventing pregnancy. Like, the method is not hard to practice. It's accessing that information, which has become so difficult intentionally. So if you take, birth, for example, birth was systematically taken out of the hands of women. So much so that most of the work that I used to do with women when I was coaching women who were birthing in the medical paradigm, so who were planning hospital births, birthing center births, births with home birth licensed midwives, all of the work was the unlearning and getting back to the core of what all women know, whether we're talking about birth, whether we're talking about how to release a pregnancy. I mean, a lot of it actually is intuition. It's just, that it's been blocked on so many levels, on a practical level, on a spiritual level, on an emotional level. It's just, we have come against all these walls. So sovereignty means like not having to depend on someone who's going to demand something of you either, right? So having a community, interconnectedness, like wanting to call on your neighbor or your sister or your friend doesn't mean you're not sovereign. So when I think of sovereignty, I think of a release of these political systems, governmental systems on a state and then federal level. This also, means like not needing not clinging to needing like health insurance, right? Which again creates this kind of dependence. And again, we're not talking about emergency states. We're talking about natural physiologic events that happen within the body.
Yeah, and I mean, as I understand it, I mean, one of my big frustrations with conversations around women's reproductive rights and reproductive freedoms is that women, especially young women, really don't understand their bodies and they don't understand their reproductive cycles. And that included myself as a young woman. You know, I didn't know how ovulation worked. I didn't know that, you know, you can't literally get pregnant any day of the month. I mean, I think you can only get pregnant like 2 days out of the whole month. Is that right? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, ovulation is about 12 to 24 hours, but because of the life of sperm, we have to assume a longer window. So the fertile window is longer because sperm can live inside women for up to 5 days. So yes, it's true. Ovulation is quite short, but we have to account for a longer window to accommodate the sperm. But yeah, I mean, I can totally relate to that experience of knowing absolutely nothing. And I should say, like, having like access to healthcare, right? It wasn't a matter of socioeconomic status that prevented it wasn't like women of middle class or upper middle class, upper class don't have necessarily even an advantage over understanding their bodies. I have actually found that women who have access to, quote unquote, the best hospitals, the best doctors, are incredibly gaslit, as were like my low income clients, right? So it's been purposely, this kind of information has been purposely not put into medical textbooks. So if you were to even go to your gynecologist and say like, hey, I heard of this fertility awareness-based method, most gynecologists would laugh in your face and say, oh, you must be talking about the rhythm method. That doesn't work.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're told over and over and over again that the rhythm method doesn't work. I don't really like that term personally, but it's to me, like when I say, you know, like you can't get pregnant very many days out of the month, it's like women, young women, again, including myself, are super pressured to go on the pill, to go on hormonal birth control. And we are told that there's no other option by our doctors, by other feminists, by, you know, schools. School really pushes that on girls, like, and they freak girls out. It's like, you could get pregnant at any minute. And it's like, I mean, on some level, like, of course, when you're young and you're just starting to have sex, you should be concerned about getting pregnant if you don't want to get pregnant. But what they should be doing is educating girls about how you get pregnant and teaching them about their bodies. And I guess at the end of the day, what it really seems like is like a lack of trust in women. Like, you can't understand this. You can't handle this. Like, we have to control this on your behalf because you're going to fuck it all up.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like women, well, one thing I just want to mention is that the rhythm method is not very effective. That's just one of the various fertility awareness-based methods. So the gynecologist who says that isn't wrong, but what she's failing to also share is that there are highly, highly effective fertility awareness-based methods. And I saw Jen asked if I could go over some of the stats, and I'm happy to, because there's a lot of just, mistrust. So
so just for anybody who's watching, Genevieve asks, is this the comment that you're talking about? Isabel, on that note, can you talk about monitoring your cycle as birth control and how effective that is?
Yeah. So the highest effectiveness rate as far as the fertility awareness based methods go is called the symptothermal method. And so with perfect use, it's 99.6% effective. And if you compare that to the male condom, a barrier method, the male condom is 98% effective. So it's actually more effective than the male condom. Now that's perfect use. For typical use for the for that method, it's about 98.4%. So typical use, okay, like obviously perfect use, the gap between perfect and typical will be, okay, how long has this woman been practicing the method? Does she have the support of her partner? It accounts for environmental disturbances and whatnot, but still, right, at its typical use, a symptothermal method, which is the observation of your biosigns and the recording of your biosigns, and again, learning the literacy of your body, is still 98.4% effective. Also, I want to make a shout out to withdrawal, which again, like, you wouldn't.
This is the method that I always recommend. I'm like, man, I have been using the withdrawal method for over 10 years, like probably almost 15 years. And it actually works really well. And men know how to do that. Like, you don't have to be a genius to know how to pull out and not come inside a woman. I mean, of course, there's men who do it anyway, who are irresponsible assholes, and you shouldn't date those kinds of men. But, you know, that's not a difficult thing to do, and it really does work.
Yeah. And it's not something that I would necessarily teach teens. Like, I would definitely say the more experienced a man is.
Men who know their bodies a little bit better.
Totally. And so all of this, like, there's no one size fits all for all of this, haha, pun intended. But with withdrawal, with perfect use, withdrawal is 96% effective, and then typical use for withdrawal is 78% effective. So there's a bigger margin for error there. But again, like, you know, this idea that that going on hormonal birth control is even a choice is insane to me. And once I started getting an understanding of the radical feminist analysis, it made it so much easier for me to see all of the lies, you know, like see all the choice narrative within birth control methods. So, you know, like, as you mentioned before, like a typical experience of a young woman, even an adult woman, is to either take pharmaceutical drugs, which we know cause like objective harm to the body, or to be irresponsible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the choice that most gynecologists, you know, present us with.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I stopped using the pill in my 20s because of how it made me feel, because of how it made me feel in my body, like how it made me feel emotionally. Like, I could tell that something was different in my body, like, because I would kind of go on and off and on and off because, like, I didn't like it. So I'd go off of it. And then my doctor would be like, well, you got to go on the pill. Obviously, there's no other option. And I'd be like, oh, okay. So I'd try like a different, and they'd be like, oh, this one is like a different, like, this one is like lower. Yeah. So I tried that one, or like this. And I never liked any of them. So at a certain point, I was like, I don't like this. This is fucking with my body. And then after I decided to go off it, I started looking into it more and doing more research. And I was like, oh, this actually is bad for me. And nobody knows. Like, I talk to women now who, I mean, most women my age are not, you know, super fertile anymore. But of course, I have friends who are younger than me, friends who are in their late 20s, friends who are in their 30s, still using IUDs, hormonal IUDs, still taking the pill. And I'm like, why are you doing that? Like, you're an adult woman, you're in a partnership, you're in a long-term relationship. Like, this is totally unnecessary. There's so many more effective, safer, easier ways to do this, including withdrawal, including like use condoms if you want to, or, you know, your partner can get a vasectomy if you guys aren't planning to get pregnant. Like, can you talk a little bit about hormonal birth control for people who don't know that this is not good for women?
Yeah. So essentially, like, the lie of hormonal birth control is that it regulates your period. That's probably the biggest, like, talking point that women, the biggest, like, line that women will get when they're considering going on the pill, you know. So it's prescribed so young that it's not even prescribed anymore just to prevent pregnancy. So a young woman might come in, she might have acne, she might have really painful periods, she might have like unstable moods or glucose issues, insulin resistance, thyroid issues. It's used as this Band-Aid. And so the biggest danger for women going on it is that they're usually going on it to mitigate some other symptom. And so for the time that they're on this pharmaceutical drug, you know, not to mention all of the side effects that the actual hormonal birth control has, there's this suppression, this long-term suppression, or however long they're on the pill, of what actually needs to be looked at and to be healed. So the root of what's going on is rarely addressed. And so that when they come off the pill at any point in time, all of the same issues are there and worse. So it's a really dangerous Band-Aid. That's how I like to think about it. So there was a study, I think it was done in Denmark, for, I think it was women under 18 were likely to be prescribed, and I can link, I have the study, so I can link it somewhere if somebody wants it. But what they saw is that women who were prescribed hormonal birth control were almost always in conjunction prescribed antidepressant medication. And so anecdotally, like, I know this to be true. I know women who have had psychotic breaks while being on hormonal birth control. So that includes IUDs, the pill, Depo-Provera shots, longer acting, what they call long acting reversible hormonal birth control. But what they don't tell you is that the damage is irreversible, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean you lose your fertility altogether. But there is no such thing as informed consent with these drugs. And so, yeah, I mean, other common side effects of hormonal birth control is lower libido, depression, anxiety, clitoral shrinkage. This has all been scientifically documented.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it was so ironic that one of the side effects of hormonal birth control is lower libido. And I noticed that in myself before I, again, did my own research and realized that that was like a known side effect of hormonal birth control, because like the supposed point of being on birth control is so that you can have sex freely without worrying, but then you go on the pill and you don't want to have sex anymore. So it's really just for men. It's like, so men can get their pleasure when you aren't feeling up to it, aren't feeling into it, and they can, you know, not worry about taking responsibility for the consequences of that.
Totally. It's totally insane that men are fertile every single day, but we are not. We are only fertile for a handful of days, generally less than a week if you're super, you know, diligent about tracking your fertile window. Yet we have the burden of the responsibility. And, you know, I think it's important for anyone who doesn't already know this to understand that hormonal birth control doesn't regulate anything. It literally turns off ovulation like a light switch.
Which isn't healthy. I mean, our reproductive cycles, I mean, you can articulate this better than I can, but you know, it's part of this larger thing that I find where women, bodies in general, but women's bodies are compartmentalized. Like, we're cut up into these pieces as though, you know, our uterus or menstruation, our reproductive cycles, our hormones are somehow separate from our bodies, and they're not. It impacts everything. It impacts our health in enormous ways. I mean, and we see this is an entire other topic that we don't necessarily need to get into, but we see this in the trans activist movement and gender identity ideology, wherein we treat the body as just a bunch of parts, like a Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head, like, oh, we'll just add breasts and create a vagina, and that's what a woman is. And it has nothing to do with our makeup and our reproductive cycles and all these other things. You know, it's like our body functions in this way for a whole lot of really important reasons, and we can't just like pluck parts out or like treat it as though if we can just stop ovulation or like mess around with our hormones and it's not going to have a larger impact on all sorts of other things.
Totally. A woman I know named Lisa wrote a book called The Fifth Vital Sign. That's like a really awesome resource that, describes exactly what you just said, which is that our reproductive body is not separate from the rest. It makes up who we are. It's actually, like the central operating system of our body. Our womb space is the central operating system of our body, and hysterectomy is one of the most common surgeries like performed on women in the US. And, it's, my heart goes out to anyone who's had one. And like, that's a whole like core of you. That's your center point. I mean, women who have hysterectomies, like literally they move differently. It is so integral to the way that we operate, not just on a functional level in terms of how our pelvis sits, how it affects all our organ systems, but just from an, energetic standpoint of how we operate. Like our womb is the source of knowledge, and to turn it off or to have it cut out is really serious. And so I think, it's interesting that you bring up like the trans part too, because I feel like when I was trying my first, I think I mentioned this to you when we met up in Texas, but one of my first kind of confrontations with a friend was after the Carol Downer event in Albuquerque. And a friend sat me down and she said, that fertility awareness method stuff you talk about and teach, that's what fundamentalist Christians do. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, actually, I'm really grateful to the Catholic Church for doing all of the scientific research on the efficacy of these methods. Like, I am not a fundamentalist Christian. Like, what do you mean? So I
think like that knowledge is bad knowledge, and those words are bad words because they came from people that we've decided are bad people.
Exactly.
So you can't use it.
And it's like, I think that, like you were mentioning, like wondering why your friends keep taking these like hormones. And, I think the resistance to stepping into sovereignty, bodily sovereignty, the resistance to taking full responsibility is also really, really connected to like releasing a paradigm that tells you you're essentially public property and can't be trusted. And it's not a pleasant experience to like wake up to the lies that we've been told as women about our body. I mean, I experienced a lot of rage and sadness and grief, when I like came to know that fertility awareness method was a thing. Why hadn't my mom told me? Why hadn't the gynecologist? Why hadn't the pediatrician? Like, how come no one ever told me? It was. Yeah,
I was super mad, and it almost felt like I'd wasted years of my life. I was like, because I was on and off hormonal birth control probably from around when I was, 17 or 18 until, I don't know, 26 or so. And I didn't really start to understand my reproductive cycle and ovulation and my fertility until into my 30s, like well into my 30s probably. And it was just so, I was just so angry. And I was like, why doesn't anyone tell us this stuff? Like, why don't we have access to this information? Why are we being bullied by doctors, often male doctors, but women doctors too? That was, my experience was essentially being, I got pregnant by accident and miscarried. I had planned to get an abortion. And before I could get to my appointment, I miscarried. And my male doctor was essentially like, this is a whole other terrible story. Like, he was like, okay, so you're going to go on the pill. And I was like, no, I don't want to go on the pill. I don't like the pill. And he's like, well, clearly you have to go on the pill. Like, what else? You got pregnant by accident. So you have to go on the pill. Like, there's no other choice. You obviously, essentially you're obviously an irresponsible person. So this is what you're going to do. And I was like, okay.
How
and he
insensitive.
put me on the patch, and, you know, right away I started feeling horrible. So I went off of it, you know, a few weeks later. But it's just like, you know, just the fact that it's like, well, you're too stupid to figure it out. And like, and to not offer you any other, this is the only option. And he obviously didn't give a shit like how that would impact my body, or my emotional state or my weight or anything else.
No, it's they're. I mean, they're wildly unequipped in all the ways. It's, you know, I wonder. I've heard actually a lot of stories of women miscarrying on the way to their medical abortions, and I think there's like a wisdom in it. Really, I think that medical abortion is often brutal. I think that doctors are not equipped, even clinicians at Planned Parenthood clinic, like, again, you know, not to like jump right into abortion, but, you know, like, these are things that are I believe meant to be done at home in the company and presence and support of sisters. I mean, whether it's an intentional termination or a miscarriage, the body is recuperating. It's a postpartum. It's a mini postpartum, regardless of how many weeks, you know, one is pregnant. So yeah, it's horrible. I mean, let alone it being like a man. I mean, there are just so many levels of like it being totally rapey and like not okay. So yeah, I think it's the wisdom of your body that it occurred in that way.
Yeah, I totally think that. And that was, you know, that was my experience. It was like, I really, really did not want to go get an abortion. And that was a surprising reaction to me, because when I found out that I was pregnant, first of all, when I found out I was pregnant, I felt elated, which was not the reaction I expected, because I've never wanted to get pregnant before. I've never wanted to have a baby. I've never been interested in babies. I didn't want one in my life. I still don't. And I was just like thrilled. And I really, really didn't want to go to get an abortion, but I knew that I had to, because the man in the picture was not a good man, and I didn't want to be attached to him for the rest of my life. And I would have, you know, he was an abusive guy. Like, I didn't totally know that at that point. It was not, we weren't in a relationship or dating when I got pregnant, but I learned later that he was abusive. But obviously there was a lot of red flags around him, and I didn't want to be attached to him. And dealing with him for the rest of my life. I didn't have any money. I was like living in a trailer on it. Like, it was just not the right thing to do for me in my life at all.
Totally.
But I was living on a remote island. So the one doctor that did abortions was a man. And I went to see him, and he was so mean and cold, and he wouldn't make eye contact with me. This was the appointment to, you know, make an appointment. And I was so upset that I left crying, and I cried at the parking lot, and I was like, there's no way I'm letting this man give me abortion. That was a traumatic experience, just having that appointment. Never mind this guy giving me an abortion. So then I had to make an appointment in Vancouver at the women's hospital. So that pushed my date back by at least a couple of weeks, if not a few weeks. And in the meantime, I was just dreading going. I just did not want to go through with this at all. And I feel very strongly that I willed myself to have an abortion, and did various things that I hoped would lead me to miscarry.
Yeah.
But when that happened to me, I just thought, I was like, this is the only doctor on this island in this area. So every single girl, like young woman, whoever has to get an abortion has to go see this horrible, mean guy who won't even look at them, and, you know, seems to be judgmental about the whole thing. And
that's horrible.
It's like, and it should just be, and then learning that, you know, like, for many, I think, you know, for centuries, like, women have been self-aborting, and midwives would help women have abortions, and that you could do this at home, and it didn't have to be this traumatic medical procedure where you're dealing with people who won't give you any information about your body. And and don't treat you like a human being.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, what that's looked like in my life is, you know, I don't go to gynecologists anymore. I haven't been to a gynecologist in probably 6 years. You know, I started seeing, you know, because of what you've just described, which is the remnants of an overtly rapey system, you know, like, yeah. So, yeah, it's heartbreaking that that is most women's like first encounter with also the insides of their body. You know, like even the language around him doing abortions, him giving abortions, it's the language is so like it just enforces this idea that one, abortion doesn't happen in our body. And two, that yeah, we are public property.
I want to talk more about the abortion issue, but I did want to get back to birth control just for a minute, just because I thought this was an important question. Genevieve asked, can we talk about the dangers of IUDs? I was hospitalized in 2015 due to a complication and I nearly died from a rare side effect. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of women think that the IUD is sort of like the safer version, like, oh yeah, and I know that, you know, hormonal birth control is not good, I'll just get an IUD, and don't realize the impact on their body or the dangers of that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy. Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, Jen. And yeah, so there are two main kinds of IUDs. There are hormonal IUDs, and then there are what's called non-hormonal IUDs, which are marketed to women as the more holistic. This is hysterical. It's marketed as a more holistic alternative because it's made of copper. So, so the hormonal IUD, you know, releases hormones, and it also strips the lining of the uterus. So, like the purpose of the IUD is to make pregnancy to make sperm and a potential pregnancy very difficult to occur in the uterus. So it makes the uterus a super inhospitable environment by creating a kind of inflammatory response in the body. Now, it's more severe with a copper IUD because the copper IUD doesn't like emit hormones. So this is why women who have a copper IUD will often report heavy bleeding. This is because the body needs to release more endometrium, more lining of the uterus, in order to maintain this inhospitable environment for pregnancy and sperm. So copper is toxic to sperm, which is why it's used as an IUD. So the body is in this like constant inflammatory response. Which is why it's like with the copper IUD specifically, the woman is like bleeding. You know, I've had friends who have been, they get the copper IUD and they bleed like heavily for like 8 weeks straight. That's insane. That's like more blood than like a woman postpartum from a full-term pregnancy. Like it's very crazy. So also with the copper specifically, the holistic option, it disrupts the body's ability to absorb nutrients and minerals. So, okay, the body's not getting these synthetic like estrogens, but it's disrupting the body in a whole other way. So, yeah, it's all just marketing. It's a lie. And then the hormonal IUD functions similarly to like a pill. It's multiphasic. So, actually, no, the hormonal IUD, I think, is monophasic in that it releases the same dose of hormones for 3 weeks, and it might be multiphasic, and then you have like a week off, which is basically the body's chance to release blood. That's another thing that I want to mention about hormonal birth control and the pill. women think that they get a period when they're on hormonal birth control. So it's not a period. A period can only occur after like a normal cycle and ovulation. What happens on the pill and hormonal IUDs is what's called a withdrawal bleed. And this was engineered into the hormonal birth control pill specifically to assure women that they weren't pregnant. Also, when the pill first came out and it was monophasic, meaning that it was releasing the same dose of hormones every day, women reported not feeling womanly because they didn't see their blood once a month. So they didn't know if they were pregnant because when they didn't see blood, they panicked and thought they were pregnant, and they didn't feel womanly. So this withdrawal week, this week, the sugar pill week that's been engineered into hormonal pharmaceutical birth control is a big fat lie. So I cannot tell you how many women I have spoken to whose jaw dropped when I tell them that they have not had a period in 10 years. They say, but I use tampons. No, it's not a period. It's your endometrium, but it's your body's desperate attempt to reset, because it's like, what happened to those hormones that we just took for 3 weeks? Like, they're gone. And so it starts to go into withdrawal. So just wanted to name that. But the last thing I want to say about IUDs is that there are tons of lawsuits with the Mirena IUD. And so anyone who's been injured by an IUD can now like take legal action and get compensated pretty well because they're fucked.
I had a friend who went on Deburprovera when we were in our early 20s, and I don't think that, do they prescribe that anymore? I don't hear about anyone using that anymore because I've just heard so many like horror stories about it.
I'm pretty sure it's still on the market. I think the Escher implant was taken off the market a few years ago. I'm so out of the allopathic world that like I'm actually not up to date on like which ones are still on the market, because I'm exclusively like outside of this paradigm now, almost exclusively, other than some like random consultations. But yeah, that's a bad one. That's a really bad one.
Yeah. I know that, I mean, it's not, I always feel a bit like guilty of, blaming feminists for things that weren't necessarily instigated or initiated by feminists. But I mean, feminists really have framed the conversation around reproductive rights and around the pill as being liberatory, and fighting for legal abortion and things like that. And, I know that, when other women or when feminists or when anybody challenges that, this happened to Holly Grigg Spall. Mm-hmm. I hope I said her last name right.
She wrote Sweetening
the Pill. Yeah, which explained how bad the pill was for women. And she got super attacked by a ton of feminists. And I get attacked by feminists just for saying things like, I don't want to have a conversation about abortion that's limited to legal versus illegal. We shouldn't have to rely on the medical establishment or on the government, on law, to allow us to have abortions. We don't need that. Women have been having abortions for much, much longer than this debate has been going on. I mean, what do people think happened prior to this conversation, which, began kind of, I don't know, I guess in the 60s or so. I wonder, I mean, first of all, let's sort of back up a little bit. What's your reaction to what's going on in Texas right now with this legislation, and then the activism in response around, my body, my choice?
Mm-hmm. So because I'm operating and coaching women outside of this medical paradigm, like entirely, other than like I am completely bleeding out emergency, which is like also a nuanced conversation. A lot of women who think they're bleeding out and hemorrhaging aren't. But we don't have the tools collectively to know how to manage that kind of thing at home.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
So I'll give you, okay, so recently, a couple, so I know a couple women recently who, I know a couple women whose family members and friends have miscarried in the past 6 to 8 months. And their stories are all the same. They start to bleed at home. They call their midwife. And when I say midwife, in this case, I'm talking about someone who's been licensed by the state, not like a traditional midwife, not an authentic midwife. I'm talking about a midwife who has been licensed by the state, will tell them, go to the hospital, let them check you out, right? There's this not wanting to take responsibility for attending this woman in her home and monitoring the bleeding, which would require this woman to essentially move in with her. Right? And the woman herself has been told her whole life that she doesn't really know what's going on with her body, and to defer to her midwife, who she trusts because she thinks the licensed midwife, is a better option than the OBGYN, which is sometimes true, sometimes not. So this woman goes to the hospital. She has all these invasive tests and procedures, kind of feeding into this being an emergency when it was never an emergency, And again, this is not to dismiss the real fear women have when they see huge clots coming out of their bodies after they've released a pregnancy. But this culture of creating emergencies out of normal physiologic events, I think, needs to be examined. So whether we're talking about birth, preventing pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion. So when all of this was going on, the thoughts that I was having is like, oh shit, we need to get even more resourced. Like, the timeline has just been pushed up to know who's around, know where know the places and the women you can get the things that you need, and to start skill sharing again. And again, always coming back to debunking the myth that abortion is dangerous and that women are going to be using dirty hangers. The dirty hanger thing is something that male doctors were doing in clinical settings before they understood bacteria and proper hygiene practices. That kind of dirty shit was happening in a clinical setting.
I love how that was erased. I didn't know that. I don't really understand the dirty hanger history, but I mean, I certainly didn't know that was what was going on in doctors' clinics. And then they have the gall to say, sorry, you can't do this yourself. It's too dangerous. A doctor has to do this for you. And we're actually going to decide whether or not you're allowed to even do that. As if anybody gets to decide whether or not a woman can have an abortion. Nobody gets to decide. Women can do what they want to do. But it's you did this, and then you still won't let women take care of themselves, and you won't let midwives, you won't let other women help women with this process either. That's a whole other thing that I wanted to talk to you about as well, which is that, as I understand it, before the male-centered medical establishment took abortion as their own and decided to, it's funny to talk about an illegal versus illegal sense, because it still is illegal in some ways, because, it's only doctors who are allowed to do this procedure legally. But as I understand it, this was something that midwives were helping women with for centuries before midwifery was criminalized.
Yeah, totally. And the problem with midwifery as it stands today is it's an offshoot of modern obstetrics. So even using the word, when you use the word midwifery, people are hearing, I think most people are probably hearing like this wise elder woman who like is so loving and is like anti-establishment, but that's not the case. Like midwifery, they did it very systematically and very intentionally. When I say they, I mean modern obstetrics. Instead of pushing, you know, traditional midwives who have had knowledge passed down to them generation from generation, instead of pushing them to the outskirts of society, modern obstetrics said, we're going to absorb you and you're going to be more like us, which is exactly what happened. So I know very few licensed midwives who would move in with a woman and walk with her for like the days that it takes for her to release her pregnancy. I have walked with women who have had second trimester pregnancy releases, and we're talking 2 to 3 months minimum of like live-in support. Like this isn't like when you allow the body to do what it needs to do and you forfeit, you know, a vacuum or medical, you know, in clinic abortion, like it's not so cut and dry. And what that process has done, what I've seen it do is really create the space for women to trust themselves. Am I okay? Is this okay? What is happening? Like, can I determine if I am in need or not? Yes. Do I need support? Do I need to go to a hospital? Can I manage this at home? Can I change my mind? You know, whatever that means to each woman. So there's a lot of, I think, resiliency that happens with women beyond just a body literacy when space is created for normal physiologic events to occur in the home. Now, I understand that, again, the accessibility for finding a wise woman in your community, like that's the hard part. You know, finding someone, you know, the way that I talk about my support for women in birth is like, or when I'm talking to women who are choosing women to attend their birth, I'll say, you know, it's really important that you find someone who can hold your fear. Because most people can't do that. Most people are uncomfortable holding that. And that doesn't mean you're taking responsibility for what is going on. It means that like you can hold her fear and you can trust her authority, but you can't create that space for someone who isn't already there themselves, which is why like the only clients I support now are women who are in total trust and in their power and in their authority and see themselves that way, not just taking my word for it. So that's a kind of a long answer to like my thought process around the Texas abortion stuff is just like, oh shit, we got to like get our shit together because we can't depend on these systems anymore. I mean, they are crumbling before our eyes. I mean, in most cases, you can't get, you know, I'm not exactly sure what the case is in Texas, but I know like in New York State, for example, you know, to go into a hospital, to even be seen and be treated, you have to consent. You have to be coerced basically into a COVID test, you know? So again,
okay, of course.
Like these
will they
systems,
even let you in without a vaccine?
I don't know, and I don't want to find out.
Yeah, no abortions for the unvaccinated. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest. I mean, I want to, somebody in the comments, we can talk more about that issue too in a bit, but I want to talk about the various methods of self-abortion, and a couple people in the comments asked what you thought about the abortion pill that's available online. I don't know how to say this.
Misoprostol.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the trade name, it's also called Cytotec. So I believe it was like originally developed to treat stomach ulcers, but I've seen it most used in when I used to attend births in hospitals. I attended a lot of synthetic inductions, and so it's an induction medication as well. It like dilates the cervix and basically creates like contraction. So it can be used to induce a birth. It can be used to cause an abortion. I've seen it and heard about it used in conjunction with herbs and whatnot. I think there's a lot to be learned, first of all, about different at-home abortion methods. And my number one recommendation is a book called Natural Liberty. It's a book that every woman should have, like literally, especially given what's going on with these systems crumbling. Because I don't know how much longer also, like, we're not in control of what gets taken off the internet and whatnot. So I think having this like hard copy book is so essential. So it's called Natural Liberty. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is a need for access to drugs like miso for at-home abortion, particularly if we're talking, after 8 weeks, a pregnancy that's been going on for more than 8 weeks. Like, there are herbs and protocols that I know women use for herbal abortion, but again, the effectiveness goes down the longer you're pregnant. So if we're talking about a second trimester abortion, from all that I have learned and heard, it is necessary to have miso at that stage. So it can be pretty easily found online. You can order it online. It's a pretty accessible drug to have. And I know a lot of women who like stocked up on it when the Texas stuff was announced. So yeah.
And I think there's other methods too. I remember learning from Carol Downer about the methods that she was trying to teach women about, or that she still is. Yeah, thank you. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's a more gentle version of like what a woman would experience in a clinical setting with like a vacuum, but it's basically like this long, skinny, cylindrical, like silicone tubing that's attached to a suction. And it's the process of like gently suctioning out the lining of the uterus. So it's inserted through the vagina, up through the cervix, and it uses a kind of a vacuum aspirator to suck out the lining of the uterus. So again, something like that is really not so effective, I think, past around 8 weeks, 10 weeks. I would have to reference the book, the Natural Liberty book that goes into all of that. But it's like, it's a DIY thing. Like, you could order all the things you need to make one at home. And it sounds like, I can already hear like people being like, that sounds unhygienic, but like, it's scary until you learn how to do it, and this is the problem. Like, this is the problem. Most women aren't attending monthly menstrual extraction workshops.
Well, and there should just be access to women who know how to do it. I mean, there are women who are super experienced with these kinds of processes and procedures. And you shouldn't have to be alone at home trying to figure this out. Like, I wouldn't recommend that to somebody. Maybe you would, but like, especially the herbal thing, because I think that you really need to know what you're doing in order for that to be a successful.
Yeah, I definitely think with herbs, dosing is really important. I think the should thing is interesting because, like, whenever I think of the word should, I think of like not aligning with like reality. Like, okay, yeah, they shouldn't have taken birth out of our hands, but they did. Yeah. And so now we're here. So what do we do? So, I hear you. And if we're always waiting for like someone to advertise the next thing, like it's never going to happen. And I feel like a lot of what's going on too is we're in this reset. like our lines, our matrilineal like wisdom lines have been severed, and we're in this reset where we are fumbling a bit. You know, it's like okay to be like, I don't know everything because my mom didn't teach me this, and that's okay. And I'm trying to piece it together through books, through the women who are around who have this knowledge, like Mary Lou Singleton, like Carol Downer. So yeah, I think that's also a scary part, is like no one is coming to save us. And so that's the biggest kind of takeaway from that I like download that I got from the, you know, Texas abortion ban, which is that we need to like get our shit straight, because
yeah, to me, it's like this is about, and as soon as I started learning about all this from Carol and Mary Lou, it was like, this needs to be about women getting together and educating one another, and we need to be learning from wise women and women like Carol and like Mary Lou. And it's just so sad that all of that knowledge has been lost practically. I mean, I guess I wonder, do you think we should even be bothered to, I suppose, as feminists or women who are invested in female liberation and the women's movement and women's autonomy, be fighting for legal abortion? Because I'm just not invested in that fight. I never have been. I don't care. And I especially now don't care because I don't think it's what's important. I think that there's something else we should be fighting for, which is what we're talking about right now. Not because I don't care about, you know, I do want women to have access to legal abortion if that's what they want to do, but I want them to have real choice and real knowledge and real education, not this choice that's been imposed on them and isn't a genuine choice, and they really have no idea what their options really are, because they're told this is their only option, either this or this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a utility in it remaining legal, because it's going to be a while before everyone is resourced and we've regained this like knowledge again, if we ever do. I mean, all my research shows that we're headed towards a full-on transhumanist like world. So, you know, I think there is a utility in it remaining legal. It's not interesting or in my genius to advocate for abortion, for legal abortion. And that's not because I don't think it has a utility, but I've made the choice over the past few years to work towards this other paradigm. You know, like I was very much kind of a liberal feminist within the birth world, in that I was always talking about choice and informed consent, and harm reduction really was what I was doing. And so I think medical abortion, you know, in some cases is harm reduction. I would never classify it as optimal. Just as I would never talk about hormonal birth control as optimal, but I can also see circumstances where it is functioning as a kind of harm reduction. For, you know, for example, for a woman who is not in control of, like, basically if she's like raped by her husband 7 days a week, like I can see how for that particular circumstance, and probably others, that there is a utility to it in that way. So, yeah, I mean, it is scary to think about, you know, women being questioned after a loss, because miscarriage looks very similar to abortion. Like the aftermath of it looks very, very similar. So, you know, I don't want to live in a world where women are interrogated about whether or not they were in the jacuzzi last night while pregnant, or if they ate cold cuts on Wednesday. You know, like that's also not the world that I want to live in. But I do think, yeah, there needs to be more of a conversation, and what, obviously what we're talking about now, which is redirecting energy and starting to release these systems that like were never for us to begin with. Like it's very paternalistic. It's obviously patriarchal. It's, yeah, I sympathize, I guess, with the women who are clinging to this because they don't know like the alternative necessarily. Like I really believe that most women have not experienced the liberation that comes with being body literate and stepping into total trust and confidence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and part of the reason that I, have been involved minorly in this debate, and when I say, like I've been attacked by feminists, when I say like I'm not interested in talking about legal abortion versus illegal abortion, is because of the presidential election, where it's like, this is what we're told in any case. You can choose between Trump and Biden, and one person is going to get rid of abortion for women, and women aren't going to be, women's bodies are going to be controlled by the Republicans, by the state. Or we have to vote for Biden, who's going to destroy women's sex-based rights by saying that men can identify as women and compete in sport against women and be transferred into women's prisons and access women's shelters and transition houses and change rooms and so on and so forth. And to me, I was like, not living in America, so I didn't vote, but I've said many times, I could never vote for Biden. I could never vote for anybody, man or woman, who is going to gaslight me in that way and who's going to destroy women's sex-based rights completely. And then I'll anger feminists or get attacked by feminists who are like, well, but, Trump would have taken away abortion. And I'm like, nobody's going to take away abortion. Like, I guess in some ways they take away abortion, but that's not what I'm talking about. And men can't take away abortion. Right. Nobody can take away abortion from us. We have this power in our hands, should we choose to take that power back. Yeah. And this idea that you had to vote for Biden because of abortion, I was like, no, that's not true.
No, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all that you experienced that. And I guess I experienced waves of that, like with the fertility awareness stuff and obviously with birth, but people don't even bother anymore. It's like, well, right. I feel like people are like, you're so far gone.
Like, she's a lost cause.
They're like, are you even voting? Like, I don't think you're even voting. So yeah.
They're like, what are you advocating? I'm like, oh, I'm advocating for things that you don't want to talk about. So like, well, who are you saying I should vote for? I'm not saying you should vote for anybody. I'm just saying, no.
Yeah. Well, I feel like people are feeling, I mean, I think also like
saying none of this.
I think it's a place of desperation. Like, I don't think it's like derogatory or like disrespectful to say that, and like I consider myself a radical feminist, like are desperate. Like we are in a state of desperation and we are clinging. And I think like everyone's looking for a rep to like name their values and their cause. And when they don't see that in you, it's scary because they feel desperate, and I think we are in a state of desperation in a lot of ways. And, there's also, a lot of opportunity. And I think one of the big opportunities here is for women to start gathering again in circle and skill sharing, and I think we need more. Like, I always like making friends with nurses who are like over the medical paradigm, because I'm like, oh, it's really cool because you have all these practical skills. Like, I know women who want those skills. Like, why don't we get together and we can like practice inserting caths on one another? Like,
nurses are the best. I I said this to somebody recently online, which is that when I was living in Vancouver and I was trying to make an appointment with my doctor, who I really didn't like, who is a woman for the record, she never listened to me. She didn't really seem to care about anything I was saying ever. She never took me seriously. She was like, well, I can prescribe this thing. And I was like, I don't want a prescription. I want to know what's wrong and why this is happening. It's like,
we don't do that here. Sorry. Yeah.
But so I would try to make appointments with the nurse practitioners there instead of they pressure you to make an appointment with your doctor, but I'd be like, sorry, it doesn't fit my schedule, because I always had such a better experience with the nurses.
Totally.
Who seemed actually to like listen to me and care.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I have a lot of critiques, obviously, about the medical paradigm and doctors. And I do think nurses need to be held accountable in terms of like the complicity in perpetuating a lot of abuse that happens, particularly like in birth and in these like Planned Parenthood clinics and whatnot. But that's awesome that she had she gave you some solidarity there. But yeah, it's like, I think it's really screwed up now, because even to go to school, like what we're seeing with the like newest injection is that to access information, like to even enroll in a kind of nursing program, to get those skills would require you to take that special injection. So there are a lot of barriers, which again leads me back to like, we need to be sharing on a peer-to-peer level. None of this hierarchical, like inaccessible systems and testing and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like a lot of nurses have been pushing back against those mandates, and quitting or getting fired, which I find really interesting, because I mean, a lot of people have said this to the point of it becoming a meme, where it's like, these nurses used to be the heroes, and we're not because I would never do such an embarrassing thing, but clanging the pots outside the windows at 7 p.m. It's like, ugh. So just all the yuppies in my neighborhood. It's only yuppies who do this. Like, but you know, and now all of a sudden they're getting fired. They're the enemy because they're declining to get this vaccine that they don't need, because so many of them already had COVID and had natural immunity, or because they have, you know, concerns about it, or for whatever reasons they've declined to do this, and are now, you know, they went from the heroes to the enemies, which goes to show how empty that whole thing really was, which is what I felt at the beginning. You know, it's like, this is just your virtue signaling and you trying to feel good about yourself, as so much of this middle class activism is. But yeah, I mean, that's something else I wanted to talk to you about, because I tried to write about this, what I saw as hypocrisy around women and feminists who were saying my body, my choice, in response to the abortion debate and in response to what's happening in Texas. And then at the same time, supporting the mandates, and suggesting that it was okay to take away women's, or people's rights and freedoms in this case, because for whatever reasons that, you know, nobody knows, people will start calling them anti-vaxxers, but that's really not the case. As far as, you know, I've talked to a lot of people who oppose the mandates, and it's not really usually about being anti-vaccine or even anti-this vaccine, but just an opposition to the mandates, and this idea that it's okay to ostracize people or tell them that they can't function as part of society, that they can't access education, you know, that they can't cross the border, and participate in society, should they decline to get this particular injection.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad we're getting into this. So I'll preface this by saying that I have been advocating for the mothers of vax-injured kids as long as I've been in birth work, because that's when I was exposed to that particular issue. And I really think the gaslighting of these mothers specifically, who have spent every waking hour with their children, to then be told that this injection that the kid got on the 2-month visit at the pediatrician's office has nothing to do with a massive regression or brain injury or seizures or whatever. So I just want to name that, and I can talk more about that, but just more of a like broader thing that you've mentioned, which is, you don't have to necessarily be critical of vaccines to be critical of what's going on now, which is, mandating medical procedures to access basic social services. And so I was in New York for the Freedom Rally, which was, I think, 2 weekends ago. And that was an event saying no to the mandates. There were nurses who had been fired. There was a New York-based pediatrician named Dr. Larry Pilevsky, who I love and follow, and Dr. Christiane Northrup, who was an OBGYN, has been denounced by every mainstream media outlet. She, like Random House publishers, the publishing companies that published all her best-selling books, have denounced her, disowned her. So some controversial speakers were there. Bobby Kennedy, who runs the Children's Health Defense Fund. And I met up with Kay Yang, who's the deprogrammer XX, and she made these amazing signs that said, "My body, my choice. I control what goes in and on my body." Right? And I think her other signs that she made said, coercion is not consent. And when we say our body, our choice, like we mean it. Now, there are a lot of pro-life women who show up to these events for medical freedom, who hold up the same signs, who don't actually mean it, which is fascinating. Like, obviously they're trying to like give a big fuck you to liberal feminists by saying like, whatever happened to my body, my choice. But it's actually really terrible, because women like myself and you and like Kay Yang, like, we actually mean it through and through. My body, my choice.
Yeah. To me, it's not just like a gotcha.
No.
Because I really believe that in all contexts.
Totally.
It's not just to say, hey, you guys are being hypocritical, even though these people are being hypocritical. I mean, it's interesting because like I know, and I've said this a few times over the years, I know feminists who are personally opposed to abortion, but they don't want to criminalize abortion for other women, but they do believe that it's, ending a life, or they believe it's, it's not in line with their morals or whatever. And nobody believes me. You're like, who? I'm like, well, I'm not going to tell you. It's not my place to tell you. I'm not going to rat them out to you, who's clearly not engaging with this conversation in good faith. But, there can be more than one thing. And I guess I don't know if you were finished talking about the event that you attended in New York. Maybe talk a bit more about that. But I just wanted to point out that there were all sorts of different positions in this debate, despite the fact that people act as though there are only two positions where you can either be pro-life or, pro-choice.
Yeah. I think, that's an important thing to bring up. And I think that anyone who's been in like the gender critical sphere I think hopefully knows the importance of allying with women who do not share every single one of your beliefs. And I've been challenged by that just by serving women in birth, religious women in birth, religious Christians, Orthodox Jews. I've served a couple of Muslim families. Like, not everyone is going to check off every single thing and be exactly who you want them to be. And I think that's like a hard pill to swallow when you have a cause that you are so desperate to like further.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand the frustration, but yeah, I didn't, this one woman specifically at the Freedom Rally, I wasn't opposed to her having like, to being morally opposed or religiously opposed, whatever, to abortion. It was that she was using that slogan in vain, and she was just such a target. And surely like press came up to her and basically like caught her in this place that I didn't think reflect well on her at all.
Yeah, well, it's like people, conservatives or right-wing people, the religious right, people who oppose abortion because they're believing it's ending a baby's life, it's ending a life, but who also are saying they're pro-choice in terms of opposing these vaccine mandates. They don't seem to understand. They'll argue, well, but this is different because it's actually killing a person. And, the people who support vaccine mandates will try to argue the same thing in a slightly different way, which is that, well, it's endangering. If you don't get the vaccine, then you're endangering other people's health, and you're killing people. And both positions are not legit positions as far as I'm concerned. What do you say to people who tell you, but abortion is taking a life? Like, you don't have the right to take the life of this unborn child, or whatever language they use to describe that situation.
So, as far as I'm concerned, mom and baby are one until the baby's born. Like, the baby is not separate from the mother. The baby is entirely dependent at all times on its mother. So, like, it's often talked about as the mother-baby dyad. Like, this idea that the baby is an entity separate from the mother while in utero just doesn't make sense to me. And I will call it a baby. And, I really resonated with an essay that Yolanda Norris Clark wrote a couple years ago that she recently recorded as a video. And, this idea that there's so much debate over, is it a baby, or is it a fetus, or is it a pregnancy? Like, what is it? Like that.
Like, when does life begin?
Yeah. Like, she would say, and I would agree, that life begins at conception. I would even go as far to say, like, before, if you believe in, like, if you have any kind of spiritual practice and you've been exposed to what's called the conception contract, there's a book called Spirit Babies that talks about kind of what happens with the preborn, like the preconception phase, So if you're into that spiritual stuff, then there's a lot more to the conversation than just the moment of conception. But for our purposes today, yeah, let's say that the moment of conception, when the sperm meets the egg and it's, moves on down to the endometrium and latches on and starts growing, sure, let's call it a baby. That's fine. It is still the mother's domain. It is still that woman's domain. Birth and death happen within the body. It doesn't happen anywhere else. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, they are one. They are not separate entities, and the government has no place invading a woman's privacy in the most invasive way, like literally getting into the insides of her body, demanding what she do with the insides of her body. I mean, yeah, it just, it doesn't make sense on a physiological level that we should be thinking about the baby as separate when it's completely, utterly, at all moments dependent on its host, its mother.
So do you ever talk to or debate people who say to you, well, you know, a woman doesn't have a right to kill this baby. This would be, you know, their language, not my language. You know, that it's morally wrong to do so.
I mean, I can understand why people think it's morally wrong.
I understand too, to be honest. I mean, I don't think it's an irrational position. It's just that I think that a woman should be able to decide whether or not she wants to go through with pregnancy and child. But I'm not going to act like these people are crazy people or it's an irrational position, because I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Or that they're bad people, or that they hate women, or that they're misogynists even.
Yeah. I've definitely had some conversations like this before. And sometimes I'll ask if they think it's appropriate to demand, especially if I'm talking to a woman, and it's usually not women, it's usually conversations with men, but sometimes I'll ask, like, you know, do you think it's humane for a woman to spend 10 months of her life going through this massive transformation and growing a baby that she doesn't want? Like, where's the humanity in that? You know, especially knowing that everything the mom feels, the baby feels. Every endorphin, every hit of catecholamine, the fear hormone, every pump of cortisol, like, the baby gets it all. So, like, where's the humanity in that? If you want to talk about the baby, I don't know. So I also am cautious about who I'm speaking to. Like, I'm often thinking, like, has this person ever seen birth? Has this person ever seen a miscarriage? Because, like, you got to know your audience. And if this person doesn't have material power over the women in my community, I'm generally not interested in these kinds of conversations. What I sometimes, if I have the energy and interest and willingness to offer, is, you know, talking about the similarities between miscarriage and abortion from what it looks like on the outside. And if they want to live in a world where women are subjected to interrogation at a really, really sensitive time. You know, I never deny, like, trauma. Like, I'm not one to say that abortion isn't traumatic. I think it absolutely can be and often is, especially within the medical paradigm. But I've also, you know, seen at-home abortions that have very significant psychological impacts on the woman. Does it mean that she regrets it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, yeah, I try not to minimize what it is, while still defending a woman's, you know, sovereignty over her body.
I guess I wonder, do you think that feminists messed up in terms of their fight for what they call reproductive rights and abortion? In terms of this hyper focus on the right to access legal abortion, as well as, I think, in terms of the right to access hormonal birth control. And of both of those things being framed as liberatory, and this is the way that women can truly be free.
I think we were backed into a corner. I think that it was a top-down takeover, and I really appreciate Carol Downer for talking about this. You know, like, it really was a top-down takeover. I think you have really predatory pharmaceutical companies seeing a market that's, really interested in liberation. And you have the pharmaceutical companies with so much power, so much money, designing this false narrative. Like, it sounds good. Like, it sounds good. I just don't think ultimately it's for women. So I try not to think of it in terms of like, did feminists go wrong or were they led astray? I more think of it as like they were preyed upon. Like, I really see women as victims of the pharmaceutical industry. When I used to teach childbirth education, I used to start the classes by asking women, like, I used to pose the question, like, why did women give up natural birth? And the responses were really interesting, but it's like a trick question. Basically, it's the answer is that women never gave up anything. Women never like turned a blind eye to what they knew to be true. It was systematically taken out of their hands, so much so that generationally it's erased. It's not just you didn't have that experience, it's that your mom and your grandmother were also robbed of those experiences. So I think, I always come back to like the top down, just predatory nature of the co-opting of women's sincere desire to rule their lives. And if you're told this is the only way you can do it, or the easiest, fastest way you can do it, like, what woman won't take that offer?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to let you go in a moment. We've been here for an hour and a half. I have to pee. Thank you for all of this. It's been a super interesting conversation. It's been a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a really long time. And it's hard to find people to have these conversations with, to be honest. There's not too many of you guys out there. Or perhaps there are, and maybe I'm just not.
The wrong circles.
Yeah, maybe that's it. But tell me what bodily autonomy means to you. What's true bodily autonomy? As we know, people talk about that in a lot of various contexts. But what does it really mean?
I think it's the true choice, which means the absence of predatory, coercive institutions to decide what goes in, on your body, how you conceive, how you give birth, how you end life within your body. It's the absence of coercion. And I don't see it as an independent endeavor either. I think that bodily autonomy can actually only exist within a resourced community. So women who are capable and skilled and emotionally available to care for one another. It goes beyond the right to refuse an experimental injection. And full literacy over your body. We can't be autonomous until we have full literacy over how our body works. Yeah.
Okay, well, I agree. Thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's been great to talk with you again, and I hope that we can do this again sometime.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me on. And there's so much more to say about the mandates and just all of it. I would love to get into more of that with you sometimes. Thank you.
I think there's a bunch of things that came up that we should and could talk about further.
Sure.
So I think for sure do that. And thanks everyone for coming and joining the live chat. I really appreciate it. Everyone have a really great night, and you have a great night too, Isabella.
Thank you, Megan. Talk to you
Okay,
soon.
bye.
Bye.